Yeah, those higher oil prices, Dwight, trickling down to higher prices at the pumps, and drivers this morning here telling me that that is frustrating for them, that they are in a bit of shock, even though some of them saying they were expecting these higher prices. They did rise quite a bit over the weekend. They've been rising steadily over the last week or so. The national average expected to be about $1.54 a liter. So prices fluctuating across the country depending on where you are, but here in downtown Toronto this morning, $1.54.9 a liter is what we're seeing at this gas station here.
Canada didn't bomb Iran. Canada didn't vote for this war. But Canadians are already paying for it. Oil jumps, the loonie slips, gas rises, and mortgage relief moves further away. That's how modern war reaches Canada, not first through soldiers, but through prices. Oil surged above $199 a barrel, the highest since 2022, as the US-Israel war on Iran deepened and fears grew over Gulf shipping and supply disruption. Reuters reported that by March 9th, the conflict had already cut roughly 200 million barrels from global supply in just 10 days. That is not a distant geopolitical event. That is the start of a household bill. Now look at the people who publicly support the war logic. They speak in the language of security, of stability, of preventing a nuclear threat. But that language does not pay for fuel. It does not hold down food prices. It does not lower mortgage stress. Instead, it creates a political shield. A shield for the people making the decisions. A shield for the institutions aligned with the decisions. A shield that lets elites support escalation while the public absorbs the market consequences. And those consequences are already visible. On March 2nd, Reuters reported the Canadian dollar fell 0.4% to around 1.37 per US dollar, even as oil jumped 5.9%. That matters because higher oil would normally help the loonie. But in a war shock, fear beats fundamentals. Money runs to the US dollar first. Canada gets the inflation pain without the usual currency cushion. That is the first-class divide of the war economy. At the top, financial actors reposition. In energy boardrooms, some celebrate the upside. In government, officials hide behind diplomacy and legal ambiguity. At the bottom, households get the double squeeze. A weaker loonie makes imports more expensive. Higher oil makes transport more expensive. And when both hit at once, the cost of living rises faster than wages. That is how support for war becomes a tax on ordinary people. Not a tax voted in Parliament. A market tax. A shock tax. A class tax. Now look at fuel, because this is where the average citizen feels the war first. Reuters reported U.S. average gasoline prices crossed $3 per gallon for the first time since November. Then, within days, the U.S. average reached around $3.32, up 11% from a week earlier, while diesel rose to about $4.33, up 15% week over week. In February, GasBuddy had put U.S. gasoline prices closer to $2.85. That is a sharp jump in a very short period. And before someone says, that's the U.S., not Canada, let's be serious. Canada's economy is tied to the U.S. economy. When U.S. energy prices rise, inflation pressure rises. When U.S. inflation pressure rises, U.S. politics harden. When U.S. politics harden, Canada gets hit through trade, investment, and policy spillovers. So even if the war is not fought on Canadian soil, the cost moves north anyway. That is what ordinary people live with. Not alliance rhetoric, not strategic communiques, transmission chains. Now let's move from gas to the broader market split, because this is where the elite insulation becomes even clearer. Reuters reported that when the war shock first hit, Canada's TSX got support from energy. The TSX Energy sub-index rose 3.1% as oil surged. But outside that corner, weakness spread. By March 6th, Reuters said the TSX had posted a 3.7% weekly decline. By March 9th, it was down more than 6% from recent record highs. Read that carefully. One slice of the market benefits, the rest weakens. That is how a war economy works in a country like Canada. Profits can concentrate in the sectors positioned to monetize volatility. Pain spreads across everyone else. So when politicians say Canada benefits from higher oil, that is not analysis. That is class concealment. Some firms benefit, some shareholders benefit, some provincial revenue streams benefit, but most citizens pay more for fuel, food, freight, and financing. That is not a national win. That is a distributional split dressed up as patriotism. Now, the next piece is even more important because it reveals why ordinary people keep getting trapped long after the initial shock. Bond yields. Reuters reported that Canada's 10-year government bond yield rose as investors priced in inflation fears linked to the energy jump and the war risk. Broader bond market coverage described rising concern about inflation and stagflation if high energy prices persist. This is where support for war becomes especially easy for elites. Because by the time the war shock reaches bond yields, the people who can hedge have already hedged. Portfolio managers rotate, corporations reprice, governments issue statements. But households do not hedge mortgage renewals with derivatives. They just pay. And the Bank of Canada has already explained the logic that keeps them trapped. On March 2nd, Reuters reported Deputy Governor Sharon Kozicki said rate hikes can still be necessary even when the economy is weak if supply-side shocks persist and threaten inflation. That is central bank language for something ordinary people understand very clearly. Even if life is already hard, borrowing costs may not come down when you need them to. So now you have the full class mechanism. War pushes up oil. Oil pushes up inflation risk. Inflation risk lifts yields. Higher yields delay rate relief, and households get hit again. That is why this story is not just about geopolitics. It is about who has to absorb the transmission chain. And the answer is not the political elite. Now let's talk about those elites directly. Canada's official posture has been classic modern alliance management. On February 28th, Prime Minister Mark Carney supported the United States acting to prevent Iran from obtaining a nuclear weapon. Then, on March 2nd, Foreign Affairs Minister Anita Anand called for civilian protection and a diplomatic resolution. By March 3rd, Reuters reported Carney saying the conflict reflected a failure of the international order and criticizing the United States for not consulting allies. So what is the posture? Support the strategic logic. Criticize the process. Call for diplomacy. Avoid full accountability. And that is not an accident. Because the key thing elites avoid in moments like this is legal and political ownership. Canadian reporting said Anand would not state clearly whether Canada viewed the strikes as legal. That kind of ambiguity is useful. It lets Ottawa stay aligned without fully inheriting the consequences of alignment. But ambiguity does not protect citizens from prices. That is the trick. Governments can stay vague. Markets do not. Governments can say, "We are not involved." Currencies do not care. Oil markets do not care. Bond traders do not care. They price the risk anyway. And the public pays anyway. That is the second-class divide. Elites operate in rhetoric. Citizens live in arithmetic. Now add the military-adjacent reality. Canada says it is not participating militarily. But Canada's own Defense Department says about 18 CF members are deployed under Operation Foundation, supporting US-linked command structures in the region. So even when Ottawa says we're not involved, Canada remains inside the ecosystem of alliance war management. And that matters because it means Canada is close enough to the decision-making chain to inherit economic blowback, while still claiming rhetorical distance from it. Again, ideal for elites, terrible for citizens. Because the more integrated you are into the alliance system, the less you get to opt out of its costs. Now let's sharpen the contrast. Did ordinary Canadians ask for oil above 109 tan? No. Did they ask for the loonie to weaken to around 1.37? No. Did they ask for gasoline to surge, or for yields to climb and rate relief to be delayed? No. But they still pay. And that is why support for war is structurally anti-democratic in its economic effects. Not because voters never care about security, but because the people who make these decisions are insulated from the first-order costs, while the people who bear those costs are rarely asked meaningful consent. That is the exposé. War is cheap to support when someone else pays the bill. Now, where has the story evolved since the first shock? The loonie became more unstable, not simply weaker. Reuters later reported it rebounded 0.7% to around 1.3578, its strongest level since February 12th, as surging oil partially offset safe haven demand for the US dollar. That tells you the currency is now in a tug of war. Oil support on one side, global fear on the other. That's important, because it means the problem is no longer one-directional panic. It is instability. And instability is itself a tax on ordinary life. Unstable prices, unstable expectations, unstable rate timing, unstable household planning. Elites can navigate instability with buffers. Average people cannot. That is the third-class divide. Now, here is what to watch next if you actually want to understand where this goes. Watch oil. If it stays elevated, household pressure stays elevated. Watch the loonie. If fear keeps overpowering oil support, imported inflation stays dangerous. Watch bond yields. If they remain high, mortgage relief remains delayed. Watch the TSX split. If energy holds while the broader market weakens, the class pattern is still intact. Concentrated profits, generalized pain. And watch Ottawa's language. If the government stays morally aligned but legally vague, then you know the same elite protection pattern is still operating. Now, here is the final tradeconomics take. Support for war hurts the average citizen first, because the average citizen lives at the end of the transmission chain. They buy the fuel. They absorb the food shock. They face the mortgage reset. They cannot hedge the loonie. They cannot arbitrage bond yields. They cannot socialize the cost downward onto someone else. Political elites can. That is why they can support war more easily than the people they claim to represent. And that is why this Canadian story is not just about Iran. It is not just about Israel. It is not just about Washington. It is about class power in a war economy. Who gets insulated? Who gets exposed? Who profits from volatility? And who pays for decisions made far above them? So here's the question. What hurts ordinary Canadians more right now? Gas or rates? And beyond that, should any government be allowed to support war abroad while refusing to fully own the domestic economic cost at home?